Time Monk Radio. I'm Gemini, and we are getting down with digestion in this segment, focusing on the esophagus, acid reflux, and digestive bitters. Welcome back to Time Monk Radio, Susan.
Green blessings. I'm so glad to be back with you. We're having a rather exciting time here, moving ourselves from smelling the food and tasting the food to finally chewing the food. And when last seen, we were swallowing. And we talked about the tongue and the strength of the tongue and that whole complex motion of swallowing. And to me, that really magical thing that happens is those particles, atoms, and molecules of food move through that mucous surface and into the lymphatic system. It gets swept down into the liver and the pancreas. And those organs start getting ready to greet the food when it gets there. But for us, there is a passageway. It's not just like we swallow and suddenly the food is being digested. There's this long, in fact, passageway called the esophagus. And it goes from the back of our throat down to our stomach. And the stomach is very high up in the body. If you take your hand and you find where your rib cage comes together in the front of your body, that is the front attachment of your diaphragm or the breathing muscle. And the stomach lies right there. That soft thing you're feeling there is probably your stomach if you're right in the middle. If you move your hand over, way over to the right, that's going to be your liver tucked up there, almost under the rib cage. You're probably sitting up or standing up, so it's dropped a little bit down. So there's a lot of stuff going on in that area. The stomach is way up high. It's not down in the belly, down by the umbilicus or the navel area. It's up high. As a matter of fact, the diaphragm has to have an opening in it to allow the tube, the esophagus, to come through to the stomach. So the diaphragm is actually pierced in a way by the esophagus. And sometimes that opening in the diaphragm becomes lax. And when that happens, then we wind up with a stomach that pushes up a little bit above that muscle. And that's a hiatal hernia. And those hernias of the stomach pushing up above the diaphragm, and above the diaphragm, of course, the lungs and the heart, cause a great pain and great distress. Now, the motion of swallowing includes the ability to move the muscles of the esophagus. Human beings can drink upside down. As a matter of fact, that's my favorite cure for the hiccups.
Yes.
I get the hiccups, I take a glass of water, I put my mouth on the far rim of it, and I turn my head upside down and I drink. Have you ever seen a swan or a goose drinking?
Yes, I have, actually.
It's an odd motion, isn't it?
It is.
They dip their head down into the water, and then what do?
They just kind of pop right back up. Yeah.
They bring it up, and they hold their head straight up because they don't have muscles in their esophagus. If you were to put them upside down, they couldn't drink. They're a gravity feed. We're not. And it actually takes some time for things to go down the esophagus. You know, I used to imagine that like I swallowed and a kind of a trapdoor opened and it fell into my stomach. And I really didn't imagine this whole well, it's not complicated passageway, but it's a passageway nonetheless that has to kind of gripper the food down, kind of the opposite of skinnying up a rope to get it down. And I also used to think that there was a little trap door right at the bottom that separated the stomach from everything above the stomach. And that's not true either. In fact, there's just the esophagus. There's just this muscular tube that goes from the back of the throat down to the stomach. And as it gets close to the stomach, it gets smaller and narrower. And there's almost a sphincter there. So when we talk about acid reflux, what we mean is that acid produced by the stomach actually makes its way back up into the esophagus, and especially to this narrowed part of the esophagus. Now, the stomach, blessed be, does not have nerve endings. Because just imagine how much it would hurt if you went around with the ability to feel hydrochloric acid.
Yes.
Actually, I can give you a little example of this. I was doing hands-on anatomy with the apprentices, and we were doing this on a baby goat, and this was a really avid group. I just adored their curiosity. I really like curious students. And they didn't just want me to point out things. They wanted those things opened up, dissected. They wanted to see what was inside the things and how the things attached to the other things and what was going on. So they really wanted the stomach to be opened up, and I opened the stomach up. And I certainly was careful to wash my hands really thoroughly because I knew I had stomach acid on my hands, and it would digest my hands given I had a chance. So I washed my hands. I washed them, pretty quickly. I rinsed them off immediately, and then I went in the house and really scrubbed them. But what I didn't do, because I didn't really think about it, was I didn't take a nail brush to my nails. And about 20 minutes later, I started screaming and crying, and blood was starting to come out from under my nail beds.
Oh, my.
Because the acid had gotten right under my fingernails, and it was digesting the sensitive area under my fingernails.
Oh, my gosh.
So I'm like, So, of course, I got some baking soda and put it in water and stuck my hands in it.
Oh, that's a good idea, yes.
Right, to neutralize the acid. Right, if I hadn't had that, I would have put my hands in milk, which will also neutralize things. But that certainly was a very vivid example to me of the fact that protein digestion happens in the stomach. And if you're a protein, stomach acids are going to digest you.
Wow.
Wow, right. So very different thing than the carbohydrate digesting enzymes that we get in our saliva. Now, certainly, carbohydrate digestion continues in the stomach. There are specific enzymes that are made in the stomach that do affect carbohydrates. But again, if we focus on the primary thing that's happening in the stomach, is that the stomach is dealing with the proteins, and it is basically through pressure, through mixture, and through production of acids, enzymes, and fluids, turning the food that you ate into a liquid. And if you've ever vomited, and we all have, you have seen this process at some point, haven't you?
Certainly, yes.
So that we look at it and we go, it's a bunch of slime with a few pieces of tomato and corn floating around in it. It's like, those things must be hard to break down.
Right.
Right. So before we leave the esophagus, I really want to talk some more about acid reflux because, I don't know what the figures are, but I know that there are millions and millions of Americans who have acid reflux. And it is not something that we really need to have, and it is not something that we need to take drugs as strong and severe as the drugs that are currently being sold to deal with. Now, that being said, let's go back before and remember those people who have defect in that opening through the diaphragm so that a piece of the stomach pushes up through there, and these people will suffer from acid reflux, and there's no herb, no magic that is going to change that. The only way in the past that we had been able to change that was through surgery, and it's kind of a tricky surgery. And so these drugs that I'm talking about, the drugs that turn off acid in the stomach, are lifesavers for people with these kinds of hernias. They this actually follows along with my 7 medicines, is that you use pharmaceutical medicine before you use surgical medicine. So if we can stop operating on people, which can occasionally cause death, and instead use drugs, that is certainly something that I am in favor of. However, what has happened is that these drugs have become over-the-counter drugs. And so now, rather than just the people who truly need them taking them and, running the risks that are always involved in taking any drug, we now have given the general populace the right to go out and buy these drugs. And these drugs can, in fact, interfere with our ability to digest because they stop acid production in the stomach, right?
Right.
So we're not going to be digesting our food as well. We're not going to be getting the minerals we need. We are starting to see bone loss among people taking these kinds of inhibitory drugs. And, I have to stop and say, wow, isn't that amazing? We won't let birth control be sold over the counter, which is far safer.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to wonder whose finger was in what pot to allow this to happen. So what causes acid reflux? Well, now, most people would say acid. Acid is what causes acid reflux. I've got too much acid. I'm going to take some antacid. And if I take that antacid, I won't have acid reflux. Now, one of the ways that we could tell if they're right is to say, if you have acid reflux and you take an antacid, then are you less likely to have acid reflux? And what would your answer be to that?
Well, I guess
My answer is no.
yeah, I would think that really wouldn't work because I don't know that that's really what's causing it. So how
Right.
could it help?
So how could it really help? And we would also say, well, okay, if it helped, then you would have to take less and less of the antacid. And when I walk into a drugstore, there's the 500-pill bottle of antacids for sale there.
Right.
So obviously people are taking more and more and more and then flipping over and going into the acid-inhibiting drugs. So I very much agree with you. I think we've got it backwards. And this is what I understand, that the food goes into the stomach, and there are actually various parts of the stomach. Like the first part of the stomach that's up there by the diaphragm is kind of a quiet place. It doesn't actually produce acid. The acid comes from much lower down in the stomach, and it can only get back up to that area of the stomach and the esophagus if the food is in the stomach for too long. Now, what's the function of the acid in the stomach? The function of the acid is to, shall we say, melt the food, dissolve the food, turn the food into a liquid. So the food stays in the stomach until that has happened. In the normal course of healthy digestion, that's about 4 hours. But if the stomach can't produce enough acid and enough enzymes for that to happen, then the food stays longer in the stomach. And because there's a feedback loop in the stomach then registers that there's still food there and says, get out of here, and starts making much more acid. And because the food has been there and because there's this kneading action that's going on in the stomach, this food that has been saturated now in acid now makes its way back up to the top part of the stomach where it doesn't belong. So, in fact, it's the stomach's inability to produce acid that actually causes it then to produce more. So herbalists say, well, of course, and this is very easily dealt with, we need to simply bring up the production of acid at the beginning of the meal, at the beginning of the digestive function, and that is called digestive bitters. There's a wide range of plants. If you've ever visited anywhere in Europe, you know that it is a custom in many places, in many countries in Europe, that you begin your meal with an aperitif. And that aperitif is something that is usually very bitter. And those digestive bitters, being liquids, go rapidly through the esophagus, and being liquid, go rapidly out of the stomach and go to the liver and start feeding the liver and nourishing the liver, and because they have passed through the stomach, wake the stomach up and get the stomach to start producing the acid that's needed. And then as the food comes along, it's like everybody who has a part to play is already in their costume with their makeup on and ready for the curtain to rise, instead of scurrying around going, oh my goodness, I didn't realize it was time. Some easy-to-get digestive bitters would include dandelion. And that's all parts of dandelion. I often say that dandelion is the most generous plant because any part of the dandelion harvested at any time and prepared in virtually any way will help. So that could be the root tinctured, that could be the leaves turned into a vinegar. My granddaughter and I made a dandelion flower vinegar, which I'm quite partial to. The only part of dandelion that I've never heard anybody using is the seeds, and I guess that's because they're kind of hard to catch.
Mm.
A Swiss herbalist uses the flowering stalks, and she has people soak 1 to 3 of the flowering stalks in a glass of water overnight and then drink that couple of sips before each meal.
That's a good idea.
It's so easy to use dandelion to improve digestive effectiveness. It not only is a bitter and functions as a digestive bitter, it also improves the appetite. It improves the liver's ability to produce bile, which then breaks down your fat. It strengthens and nourishes the liver and the pancreas. And little dandelion before your meal really sets the stage for good digestion. Other common local bitters that we have easy access to would include chicory, which some people call the blue-flowered dandelion. Of course, the flower stalk is much taller than dandelion, and it looks a little different, but they are used very much interchangeably. Burdock root, which is not very bitter, but is included as a digestive bitter. If you ever tasted burdock leaves, you'll know why it's included as a bitter. It's amazing how such a sweet root can produce such a bitter leaf. Yellow dock root, which is surely a bitter. And a whole host of other things, right up to wormwood, considered one of the most bitter substances in the world. It's said that a single drop of wormwood in a swimming pool could still be tasted.
Oh, no kidding.
All right. And yet, wormwood makes absinthe, which is an aperitif. So many people use coffee as a digestive bitter. And the difficulty with that is that coffee itself is extremely acidic. The ways that I have seen coffee used as a digestive bitter is a tiny amount, a very strong coffee at the end of the meal rather than at the beginning. As a matter of fact, my consort and I were in Paris to celebrate my daughter's graduation from a culinary school there. And we went to a restaurant on the Champs-Élysées, and he ordered coffee before his meal. And it was wonderful. The waiter pretended that he could not understand his French. And when my consort said it in English, he pretended he could not understand his English because, of course, to them, you simply don't drink coffee before you eat. It's after you eat it. There's no way that he was going to bring my sweetheart coffee before his meal, no matter what language he has for it in, because it simply wasn't done. And, for myself, I have, very good and powerful digestion, especially when I'm making my own food. And when I'm eating on, my usual timetable. But in Spain, I could not eat on my usual timetable. Getting food in Spain, it turned out to be really quite difficult, especially because the last meal of the day comes quite late in the day and is incredibly, shall we say, heavy. Really, loaded dishes. And I found a great peace in my digestive system from drinking that little bit of espresso that I was given at the very end of the meal there. And I said to myself, here is my digestive bitter. This is how we get through this meal digestive system. Stand up and clap. So sometimes, of course, when I'm out and about, and I do travel, and I do eat strange things at times, I do get, just that kind of queasy feeling or that little kind of burning sensation. Goodness only knows what was in the food. But I carry slippery elm with me. And slippery elm immediately stops that sensation. It immediately puts out the fire. And we'll be talking next month about some pretty severe things that can happen within the digestive system. And we'll be coming back to slippery elm because slippery elm is not just a really good idea and something that I certainly wouldn't leave home without, but it is a really big medicine. It is safe. It is nutritive. If you have a whole bunch of slippery elm balls and your kid gets into them and eats them all, no harm will come to your kid at all. As a matter of fact, slippery elm was considered a survival food by the people who lived in the Adirondacks. Adirondack means eats the bark. The Adirondack people ate the bark, especially the bark of slippery elm, because of its nutritive value and its ability to, what I call, reset the digestive system. It powerfully reestablishes health throughout the mucous surfaces of the digestive system. All the way from the mouth through the esophagus into the stomach, through the small intestine and the large intestine. Slippery elm is an aid to every part of the digestive system and to every misery that the digestive system will suffer from. We will be talking more and more about slippery elm as we move deeper into the digestive system. But right here, we're saying that taking some slippery elm, and I'll tell you my favorite form, will put out that fire of acid reflux. My favorite form for using slippery elm is to buy the slippery elm powder and to mix it with honey to the consistency of pie dough. And I do that just as though I were making pie dough. I put the slippery elm powder into a bowl, and I drizzle some honey in it, and I mushel it together with my fingers, and I drizzle some more honey. And, of course, I'm drizzling it, but holding the jar with my left hand and mushling up with my right hand until it does form into a dough. And then I break pieces off those doughs, roll them between my palms into round shapes, roughly the size of a macadamia nut or a hazelnut, and then roll them in some slippery elm powder so they don't stick together or stick to the storage tin that I'm going to put them in any little, tin that you find in stores with breath mints or other things like that in them is a wonderful storage space for your slippery elm balls. And that's how I carry them with me when I go traveling, so that I have them on hand. Should for some reason I forget to have them in my luggage, or should I run out, which has never happened, I would go to a health food store and I would buy slippery elm lozenges. And they're still sold in health food stores, and they're sold for ease of sore throat. But they work just as well, as I said, through the entire digestive system: mouth, throat, esophagus, stomach, intestines, all the way through. They'll be a lot more expensive than making your own slippery elm balls, but there they are, right for sale. How easy is that? Now we have still a few more topics, and we're starting to run low on time, so let's move right into those. If you were living in India, what would be your chances of getting a glass of ice?
Slim.
Very slim, huh?
Yes.
If you were living in China, what would be your chances of getting ice?
I'm not sure about China, but I would assume slim.
Very poor chances. Now, if we're an American, staying in American places, we'll get ice. But if we're talking about the average person in either India or China, ice is simply not, available to them. So if they want it, it's a pathology. And so traditional Chinese medicine and Ayurvedic medicine are rather hysterical about iced beverages and cold things. And they actually will tell you that they're horribly injurious to your health. It's simply not so. We talked last time about what happens when we drink hot liquids and how they stay in the stomach. And because they stay in the stomach, they give us a feeling of fullness and a feeling of satiation. And those nutritive hot drinks and hot soups stay there. Cold is just the opposite. If you take a cold drink, it immediately leaves the stomach. So if you're really hot and you're really thirsty, do you want a hot drink or a cold drink? You want a cold drink. And the colder it is, the faster it will get out of Dodge. So cold drinks don't dilute digestive juices any more than hot drinks do. And somebody said to me, well, the stomach is a chemical lab, and you have to have your chemical lab hot in order for it to work. And I said, and that's probably why it gets rid of cold drinks immediately. They go right out of the stomach and right into the blood so that you really feel better very, very fast. I talk a lot about drinking nourishing herbal infusion. I have a cup of nourishing herbal infusion with me right here, and it's over ice. I love my infusions, iced summer or winter. I am usually drinking iced infusion. What else can go on in the stomach? The stomach usually contains a specialized bacteria called Helicobacter pylori. It is very specialized. It actually thrives in acid. Most bacteria, of course, are killed by acid, but not this one. And unfortunately for us, if things get a little iffy for us, this bacteria can actually start to eat the stomach itself. And it causes ulcerations in the stomach. And it can get out of the stomach and into the small intestine and actually cause ulcerations in the duodenum, which is the beginning part of the small intestine. Now, I bet you already know how we're going to soothe the pain of those ulcers. You're right. Slippery elm, and especially the slippery elm balls with the honey. But herbalists have known for a very long time about this bacteria and have known how to actually get rid of it. And that is that cabbage kills it. Now, this is one situation in which we want that cabbage to be raw. So the traditional way that I was taught to do this is to take cabbage and to grate it into a cloth and to squeeze that cloth to get the juice from the cabbage. And then you take a potato and you grate the potato into a different cloth and you squeeze that cloth to get the juice from the potato. And you take 1 or 2 tablespoons of the cabbage juice, and that's to kill the bacteria. And then you follow that with 1 or 2 tablespoons of the potato juice, which acts like the slippery elm. It's starchy, and it kind of coats the stomach, and it stops the pain. And interestingly enough, I have rarely seen anybody need to do this more than 6 to 8 times. It's usually done about every 8 hours. You could do it as many as 3 times during a day. And a couple of large spoonfuls is what I was taught to use. There you go. The down home out of Russia cure for stomach ulcers. Well, it's been an eventful time together here. We
Yes.
we have gotten down the esophagus. And we have talked about acid reflux and what's going on with acid reflux, and we have talked about digestive bitters, and I've also moved into hot and cold foods and ulcers in the stomach and slippery elm. Because my eye just went down from week 3 to week 4. So we have already done some of what we promised you in week 4, but come back and we will be with you in week 4 of September, and we will talk about more things that are happening in the stomach. Green
Sounds
blessings,
great, Susan.
everybody.
Thank you, Susan. Next week, we will delve into the stomach and discuss protein digestion, effects of hot foods and cold foods, Heliobacter pylori, and ulcers, as well as one of my favorite herbs, slippery elm. Be sure to join us. On behalf of Time Monk Radio, be well.